Hi, Monday, June 20th, 2016. Maneko 64 here, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. I want to talk about GDP today. That's gross domestic product, just basically a Keynesian centrally planned measure of economic production in an economy. And the equation for it is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So, yes, they include government spending in gross domestic product, which, in my opinion, doesn't make any sense at all because government spending is done through taxation. Government doesn't produce anything. You may argue that they run the public sector, but it's a monopoly, and the only way they run it is through taxation, which is basically redistributing private income into the government. So, I want to talk about the fallacy of economic growth of the last 8 years in the UK, especially, because that's where I am, and we've got a referendum coming up on Thursday. And they keep saying that we have to stay in Europe because economic growth will shrink if we don't. And the other camp argues, no, we have to leave Europe and then we have less government, which I agree with. But anyway, this is not a point about Brexit here. And I'm standing on the fence as far as that goes for this video. I'm just giving you the facts. So, GDP, the funniest comment I heard was yesterday by David Cameron, the Prime Minister. He was in a TV program and someone asked him a question about the NHS, the National Health Service, and he said, yes, we have to stay in Europe because we need to pump the growth in our economy into the health services, which is the NHS, which is a public sector government institution. And I laughed because, you already have been pumping resources from the private economy into the NHS, and it's not growth. And I'll explain to you why he's not pumping growth from the private sector into the NHS. So there is another thing about government spending. If government spends more than they take in, they have a deficit, an annual deficit, which adds to the national debt. I'm not talking about the national debt, but that's what it does. So since 2008 crisis, the deficit that the government's been running on average has been 7.15%. So if we're running, they're running 7.15% of deficit. For example, 2015, the last fiscal year, 2015-16, the budget deficit has been about 4.4%. And a few years ago, I think in 2011, our chancellor or the finance minister or secretary of the treasury, you want to call it, George Osborne, said we should have a balanced budget by now, but we don't. So what I'm trying to say here is if GDP growth is 2%, for example, so you add up consumption, investment, government, and net exports, and GDP growth is 2%. If government spending or the deficit is 7.15%, that means that if you strip out all the money the government has been taxing and borrowing and overspending, the GDP is going to be negative because they're adding 7% to GDP through government spending. So, for example, in 2008, the budget deficit in the UK was 5.1%. The GDP growth was negative 0.5. They considered that a recession, right? But if you strip out the budget deficit equation, part of the equation from GDP, because in reality, governments don't create wealth. The private economy GDP growth in 2008 was minus 5.6. And going through all the years, 2009 was minus 15%. We had a 10.8% budget deficit then, and the economy shrunk by 4.2%. So actually the economy, the private economy, shrunk by 15%. 2008 shrunk 8.2%. 2011, 5.7% private economy shrunk. 2012, 7.1%. 2013, 3.4%. And these are all shrinking still, private economy. 2014, 2.7%. And the latest numbers we got, 2015, the private economy or private GDP shrunk by 2.2%. So now you can understand why I laughed when David Cameron said that we need to keep growing so we can, put that growth into the NHS. But we're not growing. The private economy has been shrinking since 2008. And they don't tell us about that. What's the repercussion of this? This means more and more debt. And maybe you can understand now. And I understood back then, and I didn't believe it when George Osborne, 4 or 5 years ago, he kept saying, oh, we're going to run a surplus in a few years' time. They can't run a surplus. Now you understand why they can't run a budget surplus? Because that would mean that the negative GDP would show up right away. If the government were to cut spending and actually run a balanced book, our GDP would have been negative since 2008 every year. So that's what I wanted to talk about, the fallacy of GDP and the fallacy that the UK economy is growing. And we've been in Europe, in the European Union these last few years, and we've got negative GDP growth, not counting the government deficit. So very interesting, and in a perfect world, not perfect, but in a world where government is very small and you have free markets and you don't have central planning or central banking, we wouldn't even need to measure GDP because it would be irrelevant. People in the market don't need that. I don't think we had people measure GDP before the 1930s, before Keynes started putting it into, an equation. But that's central planning. But as far as central planning go, and that's what we've got now, I can tell you that GDP growth in the UK has been negative since 2008 if you strip out the government sector. And governments don't create wealth. Even as a socialist, if you're a socialist, you have to admit that governments are not wealth creators. They are wealth redistributors. They take wealth from the private sector. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll talk to you later. Have a great day. Bye.